Good afternoon. My name is Chell Tangsall. I'm here to introduce Dr. Amy Rogers. Dr. Amy Rogers is a scientist, professor, editor, and award-winning author. She holds a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Harvard University and holds a medical doctorate and a PhD in immunology from Washington University School of Medicine. She switched from teaching university biology courses to pursue her passion for writing science-themed thriller novels. Her novels, Reversion, The Han Agent, and Petroplague, my favorite, use real science and medicine to create plausible, frightening scenarios with compelling characters in page-turning novels. Her nonfiction articles, which were first published in Inside Arden, which detail the science and engineering behind our everyday lives, are now published in her novel, Science in the Neighborhood. In February 2020, she wrote a treatise, The Coming Pandemic, which documented all the information known at the time on the SARS-CoV-19 virus. Since then, she's become a source of accessible, accurate, and reliable information on her blog at amyrogers.com. She's a member of International Thriller Writers, where she has been a judge on their panel for Thriller Awards, and has twice been a panelist on Thriller Fest in New York. She's an active community leader in Sacramento, where she gives her time to teaching, helping refugees resettle, and is a member of the high school board, local high school board. So please give me a warm hand in welcoming Dr. Amy Rogers.
Thank you, Jill. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to be here. When I got here this morning on this rainy day, I wanted to plug my car into the fusion-powered charging station, but there isn't one in the parking lot at Westgate, so maybe next time it'll be there for me. But I am honored to be here at a national lab with you. You've had some brilliant speakers in the past, so it's a tough act to follow. I'm feeling pretty good so far, though, because unlike my last speaking gig, I haven't had to ring a bell to get your attention. I don't think I'm going to have to call for backup to eject anybody from the audience, and no one has turned off the lights, although they were flickering a minute ago. But of course, my last gig was a substitute teacher for a 9th grade math class at a public high school. So I'm actually a lot less nervous to be here than I am for a typical day working at school as a sub, which gets pretty crazy. Some of the students are very quick to tell me I'm not a real teacher. Turns out I'm not also a real scientist, like many of you probably are. Although I graduated from the MD PhD program at Washington University in St. Louis, it's been a long time since I picked up a micropipette or ran a centrifuge. When I graduated, I was pregnant with my first child. My husband was in the final years of his fellowship training in interventional cardiology, and we were soon going to relocate. I took a few years off to start my family and ended up at California State University teaching microbiology and molecular biology to the undergraduates. At Sac State, I wasn't a real professor either, because I was hired as part-time faculty. At Sac State, like many of the CSU campuses, biology professors generally do not have research labs. My job was to teach, which was fine because I love teaching science. I've always been fascinated by biology, and I knew I wanted to be a scientist from a young age. Did any of you compete in science fairs growing up? Yes, I got a couple. Any of you International Science and Engineering Fair alumni? Not here today. I had seen my older sister do a science project, and I was so eager to get involved in the science fair program that I entered a year before you were supposed to enter. So I was in 3rd grade, and I entered a project, and I won the best 4th grade science project, which was very exciting. And then I won it again the next year, which makes me on paper some kind of weird savant who couldn't pass elementary school. And then I kept it up through high school graduation. Not the best fourth grade project part, but participating in the science fair for many years. Science fairs were a huge part of my life. But in parallel, I was always drawn to writing. I used to type up and mail unsolicited submissions to Reader's Digest, which of course was in my home, as I'm sure it was in many of your homes when you were young. None of those were ever acknowledged by Reader's Digest. And I was also editor of my high school newspaper. I actually wrote my first novel when I was in graduate school. And naturally, it was terrible, though I wasn't entirely aware of that at the time. But the idea I had behind the novel was actually really good. The idea was a scary what if, the premise of a lot of thriller novels, some kind of what if. My what if is, what if a virus could discriminate between racial or ethnic groups of people, the way it discriminates between species and cell types? What if a virus only killed people of a particular group? And what if someone created such a virus for use as a weapon? I expect this is not an original idea for some people here at Livermore. I wouldn't be surprised if someone here has actually done some kind of research to investigate whether such a thing could be an actual threat to the US. But it is a pretty good basis for a thriller novel. Author Frank Herbert, best known as the creator of Dune, actually wrote a book about this premise. It's called The White Plague. In this book, the group targeted for genocide is actually women. A man traumatized by the murder of his wife and child in an Irish terrorist attack engineers a virus that only kills women. The White Plague came out in 1982. When I read it 20 years later, I was blown away by how scientifically sophisticated Herbert must have been. This was early in the history of recombinant DNA. The Livermore conference had only just happened a few years before he wrote this book. And here he'd created a character who was a molecular biologist with the skill to create a bioweapon. And in the plot, he talks in some reasonable detail about genetic engineering and cutting DNA. Other than that, the book is more of a dystopian fiction novel than a science thriller, but it's a good example of how real science put into fiction can be both prophetic and educational. Science fiction novels, more I think than science fiction movies, have long been a place where non-scientists could be exposed to scientific ideas or facts. I know a few years ago, the author of The Martian, Andy Weir, spoke to you here in this room at Livermore. His book is a spectacular example of hard sci-fi, where real-world facts back up the fictional events. Anybody who reads The Martian is bound to learn something about Earth and planetary science. So the idea that a page-turning novel can serve a purpose for science communication really took hold of me during the years I was teaching at Sac State. I assigned my students in microbiology to read one from a list of science thrillers that brought to life something about microbiology or molecular biology. My top recommendation was always The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. So I'm seeing nods. Who's read The Hot Zone? Yes, a substantial fraction of the group. Technically, it's not fiction, but it is certainly written like a novel. And it is a fantastic read. I need to give a trigger warning for this book, though. It's about how close we came to having an epidemic of a hemorrhagic fever virus, specifically Ebola, in the US. And after COVID, I think a lot of us are uncomfortable reading anything like that. But it's an amazing book. Another book that deeply inspired me was Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. In my opinion, that book is the perfect science thriller novel. The structure is brilliant. The premise was absolutely original for the time, and it's just an irresistible page turner. The science in that book isn't there for atmosphere or mood. It's not what in the writing world we call a MacGuffin, and you can ask me about that later if you want. Science is an integral part of the plot, and I love that. It's good, and it's good science in that book. I could actually, and I did, talk to my molecular biology students about fact versus fiction in Jurassic Park and explore the reasons why we do not actually have cloned dinosaurs right now. Anyway, teaching microbiology kept giving me ideas that could form the kernel of a book. I still had that old idea about a genocidal virus, but the next idea I actually worked on became the premise of Petroplague, my first published novel. Here's the idea. We know that there are bacteria who can use hydrocarbons as a food source. These bacteria exist in many environments, including the ocean. You can find them at oil spills, where they do bioremediation. That is, they break down oil into carbon dioxide, water, and fatty acids. I wondered, and to be honest, to some extent, I still wonder why these bacteria don't contaminate our gasoline, the same way mold gets into my cottage cheese. And I asked, what would happen if they did? What if bacteria started to eat the fuel supply? Well, disaster, of course. So I decided to set the story of Petroplague in Los Angeles. The central importance of the automobile and the presence of oil fields in the Los Angeles basin were key factors for that choice. One challenge I had, though, comes up anytime a person tries to write a plague thriller in a scientifically plausible way. I call it the killer virus problem. As the author, you have to decide whether you want to write a dystopian novel, one that takes place after the release or emergence of a deadly plague, or whether you want to write a thriller in which there's some hope of salvation if the protagonist makes the right choices. This is hard to do once a plague has actually started. Drugs to treat viral infections generally are not cures. Vaccines only work if you haven't been infected yet. To be realistic in a book, you can't have a plague and then magically set everything right again at the end. You can have your protagonist seeking a vaccine or a cure, but once people start dying, you can't bring them back, unless you're writing for Marvel, or the Jurassic Park franchise, for that matter. One solution to this is to write a thriller in which a clock is ticking toward release or escape of the infectious agent. I partially used this strategy in Petroplague by setting up a local disaster contained by a quarantine ring. But I wanted to explore what would happen if those bacteria got loose. So there is also a quest for a cure. Another challenge I had when writing Petroplague, and actually all of my novels, is my desire to tell a scary story using scientists and real science, but not be a part of the problem of making people think bad things about science. Our literary culture certainly does not need more of the evil scientist stereotype. But the truth is, people don't read thriller novels for the puppies and rainbows. So my solution in all three books is to have a scientist heroine who is not evil, but rather fallibly human. In each case, she participates in some kind of microbiology research for good reasons, but something goes horribly wrong because the actions of other people set things on the wrong path. It's a focus on unintended consequences. And I think that's an important lesson, an important reality for all scientists and people who supervise scientists to keep in mind. When you're messing with the foundations of life, you'd better bring some humility with you. You almost certainly have less control than you think. And this is basically the point of Crichton's Jurassic Park, too. He uses the phrase, life finds a way. Books like these have the power to communicate between science people and lay readers in a way that textbooks and journalism just can't. Not too complicated facts about science, the culture of science, the persons of scientists, and of course the ethical dimensions of technological change. These are all things you can find in a good science novel. These books come in a variety of overlapping categories. Writers talk about book subject codes for science fiction, for science thrillers, and for lab lit, a category you might not have heard of before. I'm sure you have, if not a definition, at least a general sense of what science fiction is. Wikipedia says sci-fi is a genre of speculative fiction which typically deals with imaginative and futuristic concepts, such as advanced science and technology, space exploration, time travel, parallel universes, and extraterrestrial life. Within that designation, hard science fiction is characterized by concern for scientific accuracy and logic, and The Martian is a good example of that. I do not think of my books as science fiction because I do not think they fit the definition of being truly speculative. My books I categorize as science thrillers. And a thriller is a story of suspense, often with high stakes, violence, and always some kind of growing or imminent threat. Some science fiction novels are also science thrillers, but not all science thrillers would be considered science fiction. Unlike sci-fi, sci-thri may not be speculative fiction. Many science thrillers, like my own, are set in the present day, in the real world, and follow the rules of normal life. A big part of writing science fiction is establishing an imaginary or future setting and defining the rules of that place or time, something we call world building. With sci-thri, world building is often unnecessary. Books often don't fall neatly into one or the other category. Lab lit is another overlapping category of science-infused fiction. The term was coined in the mid-2000s by Jennifer Rohn, a British-American biologist, to describe mainstream or literary stories about the practice of science as a profession. Lab lit is where you'll find not just realistic science, but realistic portrayals of scientists, their culture, their thinking process. Good lab lit shows scientists as complex human beings and should avoid some of the old cliches about who scientists are. Rohn launched a website, an online community called LabLit, that maintains a list of hundreds of titles and lots of conversation about the genre. Around the time I started writing seriously, I was inspired by Rohn and her LabLit site to try to create something similar for the science thriller genre. I set up the site sciencethrillers.com, and I wrote about 100 book reviews that included specific ratings for the quantity and quality of science in the story. I did run out of steam for doing that and eventually stopped doing book reviews, and then for a while I invited authors to contribute guest columns of their own for the site. But I confess that I eventually stopped maintaining the site a few years ago, and if anybody here wants to collaborate on bringing sciencethrillers.com back to life, just let me know and we'll figure it out. So going back to my days at Sac State, I started writing fiction again. I wrote a new and improved version of the genocidal virus story. That book was good enough to get me representation by a reputable literary agent, but ultimately that book did not sell to a publisher. Then during the recession of 2008, the state university system laid off all their part-time faculty. And this conveniently gave me more time to write. I wrote Petroplague, and found a new literary agent to represent it. Ultimately, the ebook rights were acquired by a publisher, but they didn't want to invest in a print edition. I was very happy for the validation I got from having a publisher, because every writer needs some external evidence that the thing they've done is good. And it also qualified me for membership in International Thriller Writers, a professional organization that until then I had just been an associate member of. But I really wanted a physical version of my book that I could hold in my hand, give to people, and even sell. And that was my entry into the world of self-publishing. I could talk for a long time about that business, and I'd be happy to answer questions or talk to any of you about it later. Around 2010, it was more of a frontier, wild and unsettled. Print-on-demand technology and the self-publishing interfaces have improved a lot since then. And the torrent of new self-published books has slowed down a little since the early days. The gorilla in the business is Kindle Direct Publishing, or KDP. It's the self-publishing arm of Amazon. For authors who want the simplest process with the biggest reach, using KDP is the way to go. But there are complexities and other options too. So I love self-publishing. I love the total control I have over the product and over the marketing. I like learning to use Adobe InDesign to design my book's interior. I got into learning a bit of HTML code and some of the tech details to create my own ebook files. The learning curve was steep, and I invested a lot of time in learning how to do those things well. It was a big investment when I was only publishing 3 books in 10 years. So I started offering my skills to other independent authors who were less technically savvy or who didn't want to spend the time. The work let me meet some very interesting people and do developmental editing of many science thriller manuscripts that were still in the works. A couple of them I eventually published under my imprint, Science Thrillers Media. My favorite book written by one of my clients was The Neanderthal's Aunt. You can see the cover there. This is a very funny lab-lit satire novel written by an actual postdoc who wrote under a pseudonym because she didn't want it to impact her professional career in microbiology. I know it's not me. I wish it was. It's a brilliant book. The book has a little bit of sex in it and a lot of sharp wit, and I guess in a way she was embarrassed by her own writing. But it's very good. The plot is about a young woman scientist whose bio, not so shockingly, resembles that of the author, a very common thing I see in science novels. The plot is about, the character has a sister who's a flighty socialite who announces that courtesy of a lab that works with ancient DNA, she's going to be the mother of a Neanderthal baby. Anyway, it's a great story, and the author didn't actually come to me for publication. She self-published her ebook, but didn't bother with a print version. She came to me for a book review, and I was so taken with it that I asked for the print rights and ended up publishing a paperback version. So while I was editing and publishing other writers, I wasn't consistently writing fiction of my own. And then one day at church, I ran into a friend who works for a local monthly newspaper. She told me the paper was looking to expand and was going to take on some new columnists. And she suggested that I try my hand at a science column. To which I immediately said no. I had never done journalism before. I didn't see how articles about microbiology or DNA, the stuff I was interested in, would fit next to a feature on the gardening club or the local restaurant scene. But I went home and I found the idea had stuck with me. I brainstormed about it and came up with an idea to write about science and engineering behind the scenes of everyday life. To make sure this was something I could run with, I made a list of possible topics. Then I chose one and wrote the column on spec. I submitted it to the paper's editor and described my vision, and she hired me. We called this monthly feature Science in the Neighborhood, and I kept it up for 4 years. Eventually, I compiled the best of those articles into my only nonfiction book, which is also called Science in the Neighborhood. Writing those columns was a lot of fun. I didn't think of myself as a real journalist, which is kind of a recurring theme in my life, but I shamelessly presented myself as a journalist when I was working on a story. Being a writer, whether a journalist or a novelist, does get you into places. And me being here in this room today is an excellent example of that. It gets people to tell you things and show you things that aren't out in public. My first column was about traffic. I got to visit the Traffic Operations Center for Sacramento County. They have a huge wall of screens that monitor every traffic signal in the region. A transportation engineer taught me how the system works. He showed me how he could control the red and green lights from right there to overcome an unexpected bit of congestion at any intersection in the county. Before I walked out, he gave me his personal cell phone number to call if I was ever stuck at a light, and he would get me through. And my husband never let me hear the end of it and is convinced that was a major come on from that guy. Many of the topics I covered led to similar behind-the-scenes experiences. For example, I visited a stool bank. And yes, that was a thing, like a blood bank, except for poop. They took donations of feces from healthy people and used them for transplantation. The idea was to treat certain severe forms of colitis by adding back the normal bacteria of a healthy gut. Sadly, that facility has since closed. I guess the field has not taken off. It's been complicated. We can talk about that during the questions if you'd like. My favorite articles are the ones I wrote about public services that we take for granted. So much of what makes our daily lives safe, clean, and healthy is invisible to most people. They flush the toilet, they put the trash out at the street, and it all magically disappears. They turn on the faucet or the light switch, and they get clean water, they get electricity, and it's all so easy. Too easy, maybe. We lose sight of how precious these utilities are. We don't understand how complicated are the hidden systems that make them work. And we don't want to pay what it costs to make them resilient. For example, I visited the California ISO. Anybody know what the ISO is? It certainly falls under what some of you do. It's the Independent System Operator. Even though I got a private tour of the ISO facility and wrote an article about it, I still think it's hard to explain what the ISO does and how important it is. So the ISO operates the state's electrical grid. Someone there described it as air traffic control for electrons. They forecast energy demand, try to balance that with electricity generation by utilities and private companies. They find the routes to transmit those electrons to wherever they're needed from wherever they're produced. They also operate a supply and demand pricing market that was introduced after the Enron debacle of 2001. And the ISO is absolutely ground zero for managing the transition to renewable electricity because of the whole issue of what happens when the sun starts to go down. The place is incredible, and pretty much nobody knows about it. So I think this work was science communication, SciComm, at its best. I felt I was opening the eyes of the general public to the importance of engineers and scientists. Maybe I showed some kid a career possibility they'd never heard of. I love that. Over the years, it's become a guiding principle for me. You know how there are only so many hours in a day and so many days in a lifetime? What standards do you use to judge whether an activity is right for you? When I have an idea or an opportunity, how do I decide whether it's worth my time? Well, one important criterion for me is whether I'll be doing SciComm or any kind of teaching, because that's how I want to use my gifts. It sort of all came together in early 2020, like I'd been preparing for the moment. I started reading about the SARS-like respiratory infections in China around New Year's. As a thriller writer and a microbiologist, I have a long-standing fascination with plagues and pandemics, so I was tuned in to hear the early rumors. I'd been worried about a repeat of the 1918 influenza pandemic for a long time, and I knew China had a history of bird flu outbreaks that could be the start of that next pandemic. So I was very concerned. I was watching for any data about whether this new virus could spread from person to person, because that's usually the biggest final hurdle for an emerging zoonotic infection. And as you all remember, things moved quickly after that. I was a little ahead of the curve, so by mid-February I was writing what I describe as a primer or a very long-form journalism article that I called The Coming Pandemic. I turned it into an ebook and gave it away on my website, amyrogers.com. I also tried to distribute it via Amazon as a Kindle ebook, but thank you, Amazon. 2 days after posting it, it was banned from the site because at the time, Amazon was trying to filter out the unbelievable quantity of horrible garbage that people were trying to put into Kindle around the early days of, around the time that the lockdowns were starting to happen. So anything that had anything to do with coronavirus was locked out. The book was intended to give some science background about what viruses are and how they can jump from animals into humans. And then I tried to imagine or predict what was going to happen with this new virus and to give people advice on how to prepare and what to expect. My writing goal then and throughout the pandemic was to be clear, accurate, and calm. And as the pandemic quickly became political, I added the goal of being nonpartisan. I started blogging about the pandemic as a way to update the information in the book, which was quickly either out of date or incomplete. I ended up writing about 100 blog posts over the next 2 years. I considered myself a translator for the public. I speak the language of science. I understand the biology. I could let professional journalists ferret out the preprints or other things that I needed to read, and then I would read the original texts to interpret for my audience in ways that I think were more nuanced and more accurate than the journalists could easily do. The response I got was incredible to me. My pandemic blog went first to people I was connected to in some way, people who knew me basically, and then they shared it with their connections. And generally, it stopped there. It didn't, go viral. But it was a network of probably several thousand people. But the intimacy made it really powerful. Pretty much everybody reading it either knew and trusted me or knew and trusted someone who knew and trusted me. So it was a network of trust. And during the pandemic, especially in the first half of 2020, this mattered so much. People were desperate for comfort and for trustworthy guidance. And as they responded to me directly with comments, questions, or invitations to speak via Zoom, it felt like what I was doing was a ministry and not really journalism or education. In addition to just helping people understand the facts, I felt a responsibility to get them thinking about risk in a quantitative way. It drove me crazy the way people talk, and still drives me crazy because people still talk about an activity or a behavior being safe or not safe. And I repeatedly in my writing tried to convey the idea that risk is a spectrum. It's not an on-off switch. And because of that, policy decisions had to be based on values and trade-offs, that following the science didn't always dictate an obvious choice because of the spectrum of risks. Another focus of my writing about the pandemic was to try to show people that just because experts don't have all the answers doesn't mean they are wrong, or that they are useless, or that they are trying to deceive you. We need to learn to be comfortable with ambiguity, especially in a pandemic situation. As a corollary, I always emphasize that it's appropriate for the expert advice to change as new information came to light. And I learned that this one is especially hard for most people, maybe the hardest of all, the idea that the experts could change their advice. But that is the essence of what science is, right? Science isn't a collection of indisputable, unchanging facts. Some such facts do emerge from the process. But the process is all about seeking new and more accurate information, and then changing our theory or model to better fit how we understand reality. Which brings me to the question, why do I do the things I do? Why did SciComm become an organizing principle for me? Well, to begin with, it comes from my genuine love for learning and for teaching. I love reading about science. I love explaining that science to other people at whatever level works for them. But I'm also conscious of playing an important role in an age that is both fully immersed in science and technology and blind to it. It's like this fable by David Foster Wallace. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" So do we live in an anti-science age? There are people in America today who are overtly opposed to science and to fact-based inquiry. But I think the bigger problem is apathy and ignorance about what science really is, to what engineers and scientists really contribute to daily life, to the rigor it takes to be a STEM professional, to the complexity it takes to make ordinary systems work and to make them resilient, which is sometimes the hardest part. I've been given a special skill in written communication. I write, and I choose to write about science. And there are my novels. So thank you so much for inviting me. I mentioned validation earlier, and being here, knowing that somebody, thank you, Chell, is reading my books, it's really inspiring for me. It's inspiring enough that I just finished work on a second edition of Petroplague with the new sexy yellow cover that I had been meaning to do for years, and it's finally out. And even better, I'm probably going to start working on my next novel now. I've done one novel about bacteria that eat oil. That was Petroplague. One about gene therapy gone awry, which is Reversion, which you all have gotten a copy of. And one about a genocidal virus. I did write the genocidal virus story finally, and that's in the Han Agent. The new one is going to be about the microbiome. And there we go. So I have more material I can cover if we don't find things that you want to talk about, but I would like to open up to questions from you or from the virtual audience.
Does anybody have any questions?
I just had a quick question about character development.
Yes.
So you alluded to someone using themselves in their own book.
Yes.
Do you use scientists, people that you know, or do you completely drum up from your mind your characters?
We all think we create characters from nothing, but my experience, quite frankly, from myself, early in my writing, but a lot of the manuscripts that I read are first-time manuscripts. People always put themselves in the protagonist's role in some fashion. They may or may not be aware of it, but it's such it's an easy and appropriate thing to do because you have insights into that character, and usually it's an idealized version of themselves, but there's often a biographical overlap between the protagonist and the author, even if it's just an idealized one. They may change the gender or the age, but it's definitely there. Interestingly, sometimes it works against people. The last manuscript I edited, the author had done a very poor job of fleshing out the lead character. And I'm pretty sure it's because he didn't feel like he needed to. It was also clear to him who this person was and what they knew and what they did, because it was a person who shared his profession, basically his age and his interests. He didn't even bother to put it in the book, but he needed to do that. Otherwise, we assemble, I and others, we assemble characters that, may be inspired by someone. I don't personally have any characters that I associate strongly with any real person, but sometimes people do, yeah.
I had a question. What advice would you give to a young writer who wants to break into the science thriller genre?
The usual advice is the best. If you want to be a writer, you have to write. You have to write. And the act of creating stories, sometimes it's helpful to start with shorter works. Tackling a full-length novel to begin with can be challenging. And so mastering the ability to put your ideas into words is an absolutely essential skill. But there are other things that I would recommend if they really want to get involved in sort of like having their work read by other people. It's very good to network with other writers. And there are a lot of writers groups, well, certainly in Sacramento where I'm from, I'm sure there are here. The California Writers Club has branches all over the state, and there are many, many groups where you can interact with other people who are at various stages of their writing career, who can share ideas about the business aspect of it, to get inspiration on techniques and things, and most important of all through that is to work with a critique group, is to find a critique group. Now, if you're really young and getting started, you might not be psychologically ready for people telling you did it wrong sort of thing, but a good critique group where people will read your work in a way that's objective and give you kind but appropriate feedback on it, it's absolutely cannot be avoided if you're ever going to be any good. Yes.
Thank you.
One question from our online community is, what are your thoughts on the article on COVID-19 that was released from the Chinese lab?
This week saying that, so there were headlines this week. I think the Wall Street Journal reported first that, which agency was it? Does anybody know which agency? There's a bunch of different intelligence, why are they? I should be asking somebody here the answer to this question. There's a bunch of agencies that are involved in U.S. intelligence gathering, and some of them have said, looks like the virus came from the market, and apparently one of them this week just decided, was it Department of Energy, maybe? Yes, okay, somebody talked for me here. I know nothing. I only know what I read in the paper, and the paper doesn't say anything about what the actual source was, what the information was, just says that somebody flipped their assessment from most likely not lab released to most likely lab released. And they don't all agree. So I would love to hear if anybody wants to say something about that, but I'll just toss in my side to that whole question all the way along. In a way, it doesn't matter. And the way that I mean it doesn't matter is because we should be acting as if it did come out of a lab, because that's something we should make sure doesn't happen either again or doesn't happen at all. And so whether it really did come from the lab or whether it really did come from the market, we should be trying to make sure that neither of those can happen, because they're both quite plausible. They could both have happened. Does anybody have anything to say about that won't get my lecture banned from the internet? Yeah, no, you don't. That's too bad. Yes.
Well, while we're getting the microphone to another person in line, but
Thanks.
what do you think your first unpublished book would look like if you wrote it post-COVID?
My first unpublished book, if I wrote, I presume they're referring specifically to the genocidal virus thing. Well, I did write it, but this came out pre-COVID, and actually it wouldn't be any different. The setup here actually uses influenza virus. I have and I'm sure some of you are aware of this, that there was an issue some years ago with people doing gain-of-function research on influenza viruses. And there was a federal moratorium on that research for a period of time, but it was eventually ended. And so gain-of-function work with deadly viruses I don't think it's forbidden in federal labs or federally funded labs. So anyway, this book is sort of set in the period when it was illegal. And so I have a scientist who was doing gain-of-function work on influenza, gets caught and loses her job. And she gets hired by a Japanese pharmaceutical company with ties to war crimes from World War II, from the era of Unit 721 in China in the 1930s. So that's the setup there. Yes.
Testing. Can you hear me? Okay. I think I have 3 questions, but I can't hold them in my head, so I might have 0.
We'll try one.
Okay.
Go from there.
One of them is, given your scientific background and your experience in kind of projecting that in your books to the future, how do you see the future going as far as, will CRISPR make disease no longer, or the fact that diseases seem to be evolutionarily bypassing us and will be defeated in the end? I guess, how do you see the prognosis of the future disease-wise?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind when you say that is when I think about disease, there's infectious diseases, and then there's kind of, everything else. Infectious diseases will be always with us. That would be my prediction. The ability of microorganisms, both viruses and bacteria, to evolve quickly, to adapt, to exploit any opportunity, any weakness in whatever our defenses might be. It's just going. It's an eternal arm. It will be an internal arms race. I think that we're improving our vaccine technologies very dramatically and very quickly right now. The mRNA vaccines are revolutionary in terms of how swiftly we can respond to new pathogens in the future, and that certainly is a game changer. In terms of CRISPR and all kinds of other diseases, well, every disease, especially the chronic diseases of the rich world, has a genetic component, but it's not the whole story, right? There's an environmental component broadly defined, and there's a genetic component. So even if we develop the ability to really understand the genome at a level where we could use a technology like CRISPR to correct things in the genome that give us a risk for developing a certain condition, it's going to, in most cases, be difficult to totally eliminate those diseases. And I think what we'll see just in terms of therapeutics using gene technologies, that issue of unintended consequences is going to be huge in the background. If you start changing people's DNA in order to protect them from getting diabetes, there will be side effects. And in every situation, that'll be something that'll have to be worked out. Does that get at some of the thoughts you were considering?
And the other question that was in my head, so for budding authors, you've already provided good advice as far as joining a club where there's kind review and maybe start with short stories. Another one I wonder is like I'm trying to write a novel, and I work amongst all these scientists, and mine is kind of a science-based, but I don't know how to approach scientists because I'm, I guess, a little bit of a loner. I don't know if you just
They
have
love loners.
Oh yeah, yeah. Do you have any advice for approaching others to gain actual scientific integrity to your books?
Yeah, so the question of how to get good science in a book when you don't actually have that scientific knowledge yourself. Where do you go? How do you get it? I have to say, I mean, the fact that you're in this room, and as you pointed out, you're surrounded by scientists, it does seem a little more straightforward for you than for most people, because you must know somebody who knows somebody. You can always use an intermediary, right? You know, whoever you are friends with, ask them to ask somebody. But, you know, my experience is that science people, actually, you know, anybody who has a profession and you approach them saying, I'm writing a book, well, except for the national security overlay, they're usually pretty excited. They're like, oh, that's so cool. What can I tell you, right? And if it makes you uncomfortable to pick up the phone, you can just do it by email and get it started. An important question, though, to keep in mind is how much science do you really need in your book? How much do you really need to know? How accurate does it need to be? And this is something that comes up anytime somebody's writing a science-themed novel. I think if you don't know the science yourself, if you're getting it from other sources, be very careful about getting too deep into the weeds, because somebody's going to read it and they're going to see where you were wrong, and that's going to throw them out of the story. Better to keep it a little bit high level. You don't really need a ton of scientific detail to make a good story. People can fill in the blanks themselves. So just be careful of, better to not say it at all than to say it and get it horribly wrong. The other thing to consider is you are writing fiction, I presume, so who cares if it's true? It just needs to be plausible. And that's an important distinction that a lot of people writing in this field miss out on. They think it has to be correct as the most important value. But if you're reading a novel, what's more important than it being technically accurate in detail is plausibility. And so, for example, I reviewed a novel once that I felt, and I kind of called the author out on it, and she got annoyed. I said, this is totally unbelievable. I mean, I was pulled out of the story. It was just so ridiculous. So the setup, it was a thriller that takes place in Antarctica. There's plenty of threats and hazards that create a thriller-esque environment in Antarctica, but one of the major problems, one of the major threats was roving bands of killer rats. I'm like, that's just stupid. She says, she's like, and her rebuttal to the that's stupid, that's not plausible argument is, it's true. And I had to say, you know, I don't care if it's true. It's not believable. It just felt silly. So look it up. I don't know. There's something about rats, but it just seemed absurd, even though, so you have to be a little bit careful sometimes, because there are some really crazy things that are true, but if somebody's reading it, they'll be like, oh, for God's sake, that's crazy, I don't believe that, and it just throws them out of the story. Now, conversely, you can make stuff up. And what I enjoy doing, and what some other writers I respect do, is at the end of your story, you can write a little afterword from the author. This is what's accurate, and this is what I made up, and here's where they kind of blend together, and that gives you an opportunity, of course, for a little bit of education as well.
We have a couple more online questions. Any chance that any of your books will be made into movies in the near future?
We can always hope that there's a chance, right? While we live and breathe, there's always a chance. But there's no straightforward path for that, and it's certainly something that, you know, anybody who writes thriller fiction thinks about, right? Because a lot of movies and things are thriller-based, and we would all love to have our books made into movies, but the path for that is not straightforward. With writing, it's fairly straightforward, and of course nowadays you can self-publish, but even if you want to get a traditional publisher, there's a pretty clear series of steps. This is what you need to do, you know, if you want to try that route. With movies, man, it's like, you got to know somebody or just get lucky most of the time.
Another question. Are there or will there be audio versions of your books available?
You know, there is an audiobook version of the first edition of Petroplague, and I have not done audio book versions of the other two, but that is definitely something that could happen.
There's another question here. What does she think of the Chinese document that edited, or the Chinese doctor that edit 2 babies to prevent AIDS?
That's the CRISPR. That was, yeah, so getting back to the CRISPR, there was the first use of CRISPR to modify germline DNA in humans was done by a rogue Chinese physician several years ago now, maybe 3 or 4, I think it was pre-pandemic, so at least 3 years ago. And his work was pretty universally condemned as ethically unjustifiable. And he even in China, he became a pariah in his field. Although he moved, I believe he moved to another country and is trying to do it again. So I would agree with the general consensus that that is a step that we are certainly not ethically prepared to pursue, much less technically. I don't think technically it's probably at that level either. But it probably will be in the future at some point.
Other questions before we say goodbye today? Any other questions? Online questions? Well, Amy, thank you so much for being here and being our guest at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Let's give her one more round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.